Hi everyone, the book I'm reviewing today is called When Money Destroys Nations by Haslam with Russel Lamberti. Thank you, Craig, for the recommendation. So this book touches on how hyperinflation ruins Zimbabwe, how ordinary people survived, and warnings for nations that print money. I must say this was a very sobering read. Very fascinating. I love the way Philip weaves through the Zimbabwe story, having friends from Zimbabwe, colleagues. We all know someone from there, and with the news talking so much about Zimbabwe, and where we have with work branches or divisions and companies in Zimbabwe working with a hyperinflation economy has been very fascinating. But reading how Philip describes it here and weaving the story through inception up to now and highlighting key items, it was really educational. Not a very thick book. I got mines from Take a Lot. I had to wait a bit, but most definitely worth the read. I would highly recommend. It simplified a lot of the concepts and made it a lot more understandable, very user-friendly. I'll read some extracts for you. This is from a chapter called Storm Warnings. It wasn't the only market crash. The country would have many subsequent crashes as it spun down its debt and money printing vortex. In 2000, the economy experienced a major contraction from a land confiscation and redistribution project. In 2003, it had a major banking crisis. Crisis after crisis followed as money printing escalated. Debt spiral, maxing out the national credit card. Black Friday exposed a harsh reality. The emperor had no clothes. Lenders could now see how exposed Zimbabwe really was, facing the threat of bankruptcy. With the currency falling in value and import costs rising rapidly, the government had to find an extra 55% in its 1998 budget or be forced to cut spending dramatically. Mugabe responded by raising taxes but came against strong resistance as food riots erupted in the major towns. The government's reaction to the riots was brutal. 10 people were killed and hundreds were assaulted and arrested. Wanting to avoid further confrontation, the government removed the additional taxes. Increasing taxes was no longer a viable political option for funding public expenses. By 1999, the government's financial mismanagement was now plainly evident. All foreign donor organizations had suspended aid to Zimbabwe. The second option, to print money, had comparatively little immediate negative effect and was by far the most politically convenient. And yet, as the country would later experience, the eventual effects were far more destructive. From a chapter called Global Money Printing. As I studied the Zimbabwe hyperinflation, the German hyperinflation of the 1920s began to make more sense. The precursors to Zimbabwe's hyperinflation were uncannily similar to that of Germany's. Japan, Europe, and Britain have the same kind of problems with their aging populations, who are living longer than ever before, placing unsustainably large demands on their young, productive populations. This adds up to a significant and rising annual expense, eating into resources needed elsewhere in their economies. Compared to the size of their populations, pension and social security obligations are similar in the Eurozone, Britain, Japan, and the United States. Governments and private households have been living beyond their means for decades. From a chapter called Hyperinflation 101, I'm going to read a few key extracts, but this chapter was very informative. New money is always injected into a specific area of an economy. When this happens, prices rise in those sectors, making business opportunities there seem attractive. It makes those sectors look like they are more profitable than they really are. Soon the new money ripples out to the rest of the economy and prices everywhere begin to rise. Without a continued inflow of new money, the stimulated sectors are revealed to be more profitable than they were before the injection. Entrepreneurs who invested in these sectors hoping for good profits find that many of these ventures fall flat. Real resources have been wasted. The inflation caused by new money printing created misleading signals. The increased prices were attractive to suppliers, but they were tricked because costs also rose with inflation. Supplier margins weren't any better off. This process of fooling suppliers into thinking they should supply more goods to specific sectors when it is not as profitable as they expect is called misallocation of capital. The initial inflation stimulates certain sectors of the economy, but without continually increasing the amount of money to that sector, fooling suppliers on a repeated basis. A slump in activity follows. The boom is unsustainable and false. The economy needs to readjust, and soon after the initial false boom, a depression follows. In the initial phases of money printing, the areas of the economy that repeatedly get new money begin to grow relative to the rest of the economy. Those areas of the economy begin to experience a large and prolonged misallocation of capital, preceding a greater and more destructive depression and economic adjustment, which is inevitable when the flow of new money eventually stops. This is one of the reasons that banks and companies close to the banking sector tend to be more prosperous in economies with central banks. Money printing gives government great power, but those who control money printing and those who receive that money first are in a powerful position. If an unrestrained government decides to use its money printing privilege as a way to pay for its expenses, it can spend with limited direct accountability. It can manipulate how markets naturally and organically operate, and it can purchase real goods and services with newly printed money, acquiring more and more for itself at the expense of those who don't have the special privilege of printing money. If money is printed on an ongoing basis, inflation becomes a culturally accepted norm. In modern society, ask anyone if they think prices will be higher next year, and you'll get only one answer: of course. Another very fascinating chapter is called The Politics of Printed Money. I'll read some extracts from here. This is very similar to what happens when governments use the central bank and its money printing press to cheat the system. Central banks and commercial banks are structured to print money continually. A key to political power lies in the control of this money printing machine, which is why most governments have a major influence on the policies of the central bank and heavily regulate the commercial banks. They get to rig the game in their favor. In Zimbabwe, the independence between the central bank and the government broke down totally after the Black Friday crash of 1997. The Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe began to operate as an arm of the government and ended up printing whenever the government needed more money. I think the most sobering chapter that really highlighted the plight of the people was one called The Economics of Hunger. Hyperinflation pushed retailers to bankruptcy. As store owners raised prices to stay in business, the government fought back with price controls in warlike fashion. The Price Control Commission was set up to regulate prices. Hundreds of store owners were arrested for trying to stay in business, being accused of profiteering. Price control agents confiscated shops' entire stock as penalty for raising prices. It became a formalized means of looting. Agents made off with flat-screen TVs, foods of all kinds, and other goods. Price control caused shop owners to stop supplying goods to the public. In their zeal to control prices, the government ended up making the shortages far worse, which only served to force the market price of goods higher. Further compounding the folly, the government made it illegal to cease supplying. It tried to force the retailers to continue providing goods, but this only achieved one thing: worse shortages and closure of entire industries. Large retailers had to stay open and keep their staff, even though the shops were practically bare. They always seemed to find at least one item to keep on the shelves: a loose toilet roll or a bottle of jam placed on the odd shelf in otherwise naked aisles. The CEO of a retail company states, "Understandably, we went bankrupt. Who can continue profitably in such circumstances? When we were confronted by pricing control, we blamed our lack of supply on the manufacturers who had increased their prices. The PC agents then went with large mobs of rioting youth to the various factories to force them to reduce prices. The manufacturers couldn't decrease their prices either without going out of business. They had input prices set by world markets. Quickly, the whole supply chain shut down. By the middle of 2006, there weren't any stores that had any goods in them. It was an absolute tragedy." With everything going on around the world of politics and economics, there's a chapter here called Dollar Supremacy. It was a really fascinating read. Here's a quote from Mayor Amschel Rothschild. "Let me issue and control a nation's money, and I care not who writes the laws." Some extracts from the Dollar Supremacy chapter. This put America in a tremendously advantageous position. Similar to how the Zimbabwean fuel companies had the ability to create fuel coupons during Zimbabwe's hyperinflation, America over time increased the number of US dollars relative to the amount of gold it had. By the late 1960s, America was in a costly war in Vietnam, and government welfare expenditures were swelling. The Federal Reserve and the US banks began to print dollars to pay for these expenses. Countries that exported products to America had to make real goods and services with inputs of labor and material, and in return they were paid in money that was created out of nothing. This started off slowly at first, but gathered momentum throughout the 1960s. By the early 1970s, a few countries began to realize that there were more US dollars in circulation than gold held by the US. If all the major Bretton Woods members decided to claim gold from the Federal Reserve with their US dollars, there would not be enough gold for the amount of dollars that were in circulation. France and Switzerland in particular began to get in line to sell large amounts of dollars for gold. What started off as a few gold redemptions at the Federal Reserve gathered pace. If the countries of the world realized that the world dollar was no longer as good as gold, perhaps they would stop holding it as reserve currency. America's global financial influence would be dealt a severe blow. As far as America was concerned, something had to be done urgently. Then comes the 1971-1981 period, the Nixon bomb, the gold window closes. In January 1973, the US stock market crashed. The precursors to hyperinflation that we studied in Part 1 were unmistakable. The US had been overspending on wars and welfare initiatives. The closing of the gold window and the subsequent stock market crash were various Black Friday turning points, as formerly complacent investors began pulling back their loans and investments. The signs were pointing towards a hyperinflationary spiral, and America desperately needed to find ways to keep the world using its currency. Facing potential economic turmoil at the end of 1973, Nixon's administration struck deals with Saudi Arabia and other nearby oil-producing states of the Middle East to sell oil exclusively in exchange for US dollars, and to invest their excess dollar profits back into America by lending to the US government. In return, these countries would get a steady supply of the latest US weapons and US military protection for their oil fields from potential invaders like the Soviet Union. By 1975, most of the other major oil-producing countries had also agreed to this plan. The arrangement created a triangular flow of investment that gave the United States a powerful double subsidy. Those purchasing oil had to purchase US dollars first. The oil-selling country then had to reinvest those dollars into the US. From an American perspective, the plan was a political and economic masterstroke. Since everyone needed oil, countries that saved surpluses in US dollars could then fund oil purchases. The dollar remained a paper currency with no tangible backing, yet demand for it was strengthened by the global oil trade, which was growing rapidly. This arrangement gave rise to the name petrodollars, which described the intimate link between the dollar and oil. It took a few years for countries around the world to gain confidence in the dollar again, but by 1981, the petrodollar system, as it became unofficially known, had helped firmly re-establish the US dollar as the global reserve currency. The next time period was 1981 to 1999, dollar dominance. I'm not going to read any extracts from there. Then comes 1999 up until dollar under threat. About trade settlement, we have decided to use our own currencies. This was said by Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, discussing Russian-Chinese trade. Despite support for the petrodollar system, the European Union also wanted the exorbitant privilege of a reserve currency. EU leaders began to look for ways to create a centralized European currency that could compete with the US dollar for global trade reserves. With the euro's increased status, demand for the currency grew, and there was rapid growth of investment into Europe. Since the ultimate goal of the euro project would be to rival the US dollar in the oil trade, the main oil-producing countries began discussions with Europe over a potential petro-euro project. In November 2000, Iraqi President Saddam Hussein began selling oil to Europe in euros, and in 2002, OPEC speculated. It is quite possible that as trade increases between the Middle East and the European Union, it could be feasible to price oil in euros, considering Europe is the main economic partner of that region. Later, Syria overtly rejected the dollar as a reserve currency and began to trade in euros, while some Eastern European countries, including Russia, began to hold large euro reserves, then dollar reserves. In other currencies were to be used for payment of oil, demand for US dollars could fall. The exorbitant privilege America had enjoyed over the years with its money as the global reserve currency would disappear if its currency monopoly ended. That's where petrodollar wars started, and the petrodollar system, and particularly the vested interest in sustaining it, is probably the critical issue in global geopolitics today. Said simply, America had everything to lose if nations of the world use other currencies in trade. There are powerful vested interests to protect. Viewed through this lens, recent global events take on a new light. That's all. Let me know if you've read the book, When Money Destroys Nations, or what you're reading currently. Thank you.